Developer Productivity with Mark Miller.
The Azure DevOps podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Hello, I'm your host, Jeffrey Palermo. Make sure to go to www.azuredevops.show to see past episodes and show notes. And as we're recording, we just finished the Microsoft Build Conference, which had tons of announcements. Every one of those breakout sessions at the Build Conference was recorded, and you can see them online. Probably the easiest, just to go to YouTube or there's probably several places, Channel 9 that they're recorded to. In addition, one of the exciting things that happened at the Build Conference was the book .NET DevOps for Azure was launched, and we distributed, I think, 400 copies. Scott Hunter announced it at his .NET Roadmap session. And so, special offer, if you are running a user group or a community conference or presenting at one of those, and you would like to give away some copies of the book .NET DevOps for Azure, just go ahead and reach out to our sponsor, ClearMeasure. Go to clearmeasure.com and reach out to them, and you'll get some free books drop shipped to your user group or conference. Our guest today is Mark Miller. He is a 5-year C# MVP alumnus, and with his strong experience in decoupled design, plugin architectures, and great user interfaces. Mark is the chief architect of the IDE Tools division at Developer Express and is the visionary force behind CodeRush and creator of the Science of Great Design course at deviq.com. Mark streams live C# and TypeScript coding and design on twitch.tv/CodeRushed. That's CodeRush ED. And he's a top-ranked speaker, absolutely top tier, no one above him, ranked speaker at conferences around the world, and has been creating tools for software developers for almost 14 decades. Is that right, Mark? 14 decades?
I think it's 4 decades. You might want to check that.
Check 4 decades. Okay. How are you, Mark? Welcome to the show.
That was like the best bio read I've ever heard in my life right there. I am awesome, according to that.
Oh, you are awesome. And
that is so much fun.
For folks who don't know, you've recorded been on .NET Rocks as a guest for quite a bit. And then the Mondays show, the superhero of Mondays. If people can still get those podcasts, right?
I think that's true. They can, yeah. So yeah, superhero of Mondays, I suppose you could say that.
So, Mark, there's probably a lot of our listeners out there who've been longtime .NET developers who've heard of you before. But for those poor souls who've never, ever gotten to listen to your wisdom coming across the airwaves, how did you get into software? Give us a quick background on yourself and how you got to this point where you're the chief architect of DevExpress.
Well, I guess it started when I was a little kid. I got this Radio Shack toy, which allowed you to wire up AND gates and OR gates to solve problems. And I loved this toy. It had little springs and wires that came with it, and AND gates and OR gates on it, and NOT gates. And I would set up all the Boolean logic. I'd flip the switches, and a light would go on or off. And that was my first introduction to essentially what you could almost call programming. The program there is in the form of the wires as you're moving it through, right? What's going to happen and how you choose which wire to go to which gate. And also, since AND gates and OR gates are, fundamental components of the computer, I would say that's number one. Number two, the Commodore 64 came out, and I didn't have enough money to get it, but I was like all about it. And so I read about it. And I had a notebook, and I wrote programs on paper in the notebook. And this is all as a young kid that I did these things. And it just occurred to me, there was one step just before that where I had asked my parents for a TRS-80 from Radio Shack computer for nice. As a Christmas present. And they said, no, we're not going to do it. And then Christmas comes and it's there. And And my dad said, I wanted a bike when I was a kid, and my parents couldn't afford it. And they got me a bike for Christmas. And that was basically his explanation for why I got the computer. I dove into that thing. I was programming in BASIC, and I was just exhausting. I felt like really pushing its capabilities to the limits. It had no ability for like real-time response to the keyboard, but I figured out a way to give it that. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to make like $1 million because I figured out how to create games on the TRS-80 where you can like hit keys and have it do things.
And I bet in your lifetime you have made $1 million.
Oh, that's true, but not off of this. Not off of this. But I remember bringing it in and talking. I remember going into the Radio Shack with my intention to talk to the Radio Shack clerk about selling him my software idea. And
you pitched him.
I went in and he tells me about the next version of the TRS-80 that's coming out, and he says that its biggest features is going to be able to have a real-time response to keystrokes on the keyboard.
Oh.
And I'm like, no. So that was like kind of, my first thing. I had the TRS-80. I pushed it to the limit. I was in it all day long, and I created a game of Pong that had 4 paddles around a square in the center and 4 balls, or it was like Breakout rather, not Pong. It was Breakout with 4 walls on the outside, and so it was like just really crazy. You moved all paddles counterclockwise or clockwise at the same time, right? And it was just kind of this crazy intense thing. After that, I tried to get, I wanted to get a Commodore 64, couldn't, but I wrote programs in paper again and again and again. I wrote just really detailed stuff. I might have had autism. The doctors might have been right when they, diagnosed that, right? That, your ability to just dive in deeply on that something.
You mean intelligence?
Okay.
You were diagnosed with intelligence, sir.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. I'll take that. And then my next stop is I went to United States Air Force Academy, and at the Air Force Academy, they actually give you an income, and I was able to buy an Amiga, I think at the time, maybe it might've been a Commodore 64, but maybe it was a Commodore 64. And I wrote a really fun video game there called Jogger. And it was like it was the first video game I know of that had ultra graphic gore violence in like 8-bit pixels. There were scenes where as a jogger, you had to avoid snipers and crocodiles and things like that. And there was a scene when if you try to jump over a crocodile in the sewers of the city, it ate you. You would be beheaded in 8-bit. I think it was the first 8-bit beheading that occurred. So it was incredibly popular at the Air Force Academy until one day I lost all the data and I didn't have a backup. Ooh. And I learned a lesson on that day. It was like probably 1980, I don't know, 5 maybe. Backups are good.
Yes,
so yeah,
definitely.
That was like how I got in. I got in kind of through just extreme amounts of passion, and this is a thing we use on the show all the time. The CodeRushed streaming show on Twitch TV, Twitch.tv. We are like use brute force and ignorance to solve problems, right? And that's what I used then, right? As a kid, I was going right. We just keep going, and we learn and we figure it out until it works.
Nice. All right, so Mark, in this year, these last few years, I think you've been thinking a lot about motion and efficiency of motion.
Right.
How does that play into what you do at CodeRush? What's your philosophy on that?
Well, I've got 2 things. This is basically, I've done a lot of thought about what makes great design, what makes design great. And ultimately, I after a ton of deep thought and research, I am at a point where I'm absolutely convinced the answer is the following. It boils down to 2 things. And by the way, I wish there were 3 things. Because 3 seems like such a neater answer to the question than 2. But it's really just 2. And it's efficiency of thought and efficiency of motion. Right? And so what I mean by that, and we're talking about the physical motion of the body. So if we're talking about good design, we're talking about a design that allows you to do what you want with the smallest amount of physical motion. So not only are we trying to reduce keystrokes or mouse movement or mouse clicks, right? But we're also trying to reduce shifts in gaze, right? Small little changes, right? So my eyes are looking up to one side.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to move my eyes to another side of the screen. I want to be able to get that information right there. So that's efficiency of motion. We're looking for the shortest physical path to solving a problem. And efficiency of thought is we want the shortest path in the mind, right? We don't want to have cognitive load go high. And cognitive load goes high when you have to concentrate and when your body is required to perform precise motion. As an example, we're in Windows 10, but still in Windows 10 when I bring up Windows Explorer and I want to resize the preview pane to the right, I've got only 3 pixels to hit that resize pane.
Mm-hmm.
The resize little control in there to change that size of it. And I'll often go in there and I will, shoot past it, adjust, try to move back, shoot past one more time as I try to hit that 3 pixel margin in there where the cursor changes to tell me I can resize it. As a result, my cognitive load is going up because my body is required to do this precise action. And that's a violation of this, of efficiency of thought. We want things to be incredibly efficient thought-wise. One way to solve that problem is as my mouse approaches and slows down, we could actually grow the size of that control, right? Physically say, oh, you're trying to hit me. I'm going to make myself bigger so you've got more space to hit.
Mm-hmm.
That's one way that you could solve that. Another way is just simply make it bigger. Right? Make it 6 pixels instead of 3, double the size, and the cognitive load goes down. But this is something I'm all about. I'm all about what is the lowest cognitive load to consume something. That also means fewer words, right? When you're talking, you can say, if you've got a description, a path, where somebody hits your website and you want them to buy something, or you want them to register, you want them to give them your name and address, you want them to do something, but they've hit your site. How do you get them to do the thing you want them to do, the shortest possible physical and mental path to get there? That's really what you want to do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of people that I talk with and work with who are not native English speakers, and they'll use fewer words to communicate something. And I have a conversation with them. Man, that conversation was refreshing. We just talked about the essence, and we're native English speakers talk all over the place and extra words here and there. That's a good point.
No, I'll totally do it in an interview, Jeffrey. I'm gonna be all over the place. I think I can't stop myself. But when I am writing text for people to read, and it's on a critical path, I'm hyper aware that like every word adds about 200 to 300 milliseconds based on average reading speed to the path. So it's a physical time. I mean, it's a measurable time. So I want to use the fewest words that I possibly can. I want to speak with absolute clarity, or write with absolute clarity. Those things are part of what you will do to essentially create an experience that has a low cognitive load and also a similarly low load on the human body.
Yeah,
right? Because even reading there's a physical strain on reading, right? And I once experienced or witnessed a UI that had just been added to a hospital, and it required you click in the upper left and then look down in the lower right of the screen, and then go back to the upper left again, find something, and then go back to the lower right and interact like that.
Mm-hmm.
It was absolutely insane, and people said that they could not. They were so fatigued after using it for several hours, right? And we're just talking about really, your eye gaze moving back and forth, right? Your eyes shifting back and forth. But there is, we don't think about it when it's just one, right? When we're just going to go look somewhere, we don't think that that's a big deal because it seems so, we don't even really measure it, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But what I'm really big on is I'm talking about measuring the smallest amount of motion, the smallest amount of cognitive load, and eliminating that. That's what good design is. You don't need, right? If you're hyper aware of that and you have tools for measuring these kinds of things, right? You can measure so you can certainly measure keystrokes, and you can measure mouse moves and click, but you can also get a sense of what the angle shift in the eye is going to be by simply just looking where you're placing things on screen.
Mm-hmm.
right? And you can say, well, wait, let's group together things that belong together and put them close to each other. Let's find ways to get them to make those key decisions they're going to make again and again very, very quickly, right? What's the fastest way we can do that? And you start making these. If you follow the design guidelines, you can end up creating something really good with the first time, which is different from, I think, what a lot of people do. I think what a lot of people do is they create something, and then they might do user testing on it. They might see that they have a problem, then they try to fix the problem. And sometimes, and what that does is that gives you one of the best versions of that way of solving the problem. But it may not be the best way to solve the problem because the guidelines weren't taken into consideration when creating it in the first place.
Right.
Right. And I see this a lot from some of the large companies out there. They will say, well, we had this idea, and in my head, I'm thinking, okay, it wasn't a great idea. Right. And then they said we went into user testing, and then user testing has backed us up that the idea is good and that we've solved that. And then, and I don't always say this to people, right? Because they often have something at stake and it's already out, and I don't want to, necessarily go rain on their parade. But in those moments, sometimes I'll be thinking they started with a bad idea and they made it the best they could through user testing, which is what you can do. Another way that a lot of people are doing to achieve these similar kind of results of following the guidelines, which is actually really super interesting to watch, and that's A/B testing on websites. If you do A/B testing on websites, that's going to tell you what the better path is, right? What the shorter path is. That's going to give you some really good data. And as a result, I see really interesting solutions to UI problems, sometimes non-intuitive, what I would not necessarily have come up with, but that are solving the problem on a website and getting people to buy more or register faster, that sort of thing. So yeah, those are kind of three ways you can come about it. You can start with an idea that you're not sure about and user test the heck out of it till it's good, which is okay. You can start with no idea what to do and use A/B testing, and A/B testing is going to tell you which is better. Or you can go with the guidelines. And I guess the fourth approach is to not do any of those and not understand why it's not working, because I think that's kind of inherent there.
I think a lot of listeners would like guidelines, and is there a set of guidelines that's your favorite?
Yeah, there are. I've got like a set of guidelines that are like from most applicable. In other words, I see violated all the time, right, and have solved the most problems down to solve very specific, isolated case problems. The number one guideline that I see broken all the time is match. The guideline is match emphasis to importance. Match visual emphasis or visual weight. Sometimes it can be audio as well. Right, it can become in a different form of sensory input. Right, realize that visual and audio and even tactile are all different ways of understanding our environment. So you can create UI that communicates on any of those channels that we can sense. Right, typically we don't use pain or temperature because those are slower for the body to react to. Right, but if we were incredibly fast at those and slow at vision, we might have pain screens where we would put our hands up to, and we would and that's how we would get our input. But we are not that creature, and so you want to match the visual emphasis to the importance of the element. So that's essentially guideline number one. So as an example of a violation of the guideline,
well, where can the listeners find these guidelines?
Well, if you go to the course, it's in the course. I've got the course out at deviq.com. If you go to science, or you can go to if you think the science of great UI, those initials SGUI.com. You can go to either of those places. SGUI.com has got a free email course that you can sign up for, and you can get some of the guidelines out there that I've got at no charge at all with an email course. And if you go to deviq.com, you can get the whole course. It's like about 9 hours. I've got the science of great UI in there, and I've got Design Like a Pro. So both of those courses are great courses to see those. With regard, if we get back to the matching emphasis to importance, a good example where this stands out where it doesn't work is is if you, I'm not going to mention any products by name, but there is, I'm just going to double check this. There's a major product by a major company for email. And if you go into that and you create a new email, and then inside that email, you create a new table. Let's do this right now here. I'm going to make sure that the problem is still there. And let's do it. Yep. And you create a new table. The lines of the table are as dark and maybe not as thick, but certainly as dark and high contrast as the text is. And the observation is that the lines of the table are not as important, right? They're not as important as the text inside the table.
Right.
And so what we want to do to lower the cognitive load, right? Because what's happening is our eyes are going by here, we're reading that text, right? The heavier and the darker those lines are, and also the closer they are to the text too, right? Imagine if I had lines as thick as the text right next to the text, right? So I have a letter and then just enough space to where I'd put another letter. I've got a line instead with the same thickness. Well, that's going to trip us up. That's going to require more work for our letter detectors and our feature detectors in our brain to identify that that's not a letter. And you do that to me again and again and again all day, and I will be more fatigued at the end of the day, right? So what I want to do is I want to match the emphasis of that. That means I have to recognize that every pixel on screen that's not the background, or arguably even the background included, every pixel is carrying weight, and its weight that it carries should match the importance. So that's like rule number one. That's like rule number one that I see broken all the time.
So that's the use of grayscales, right? To not have it black, but have a grayscale, or not have it absolutely blue, but maybe a muted blue.
Yeah, you want it to match you basically want its distinct difference between itself and the background to be low. Whereas the text, you want that to be pretty high, which means also, so you look at this rule and you start getting all kinds of sub rules from this. Like that, and that means, well, I can't have a pattern background. That means I can't have a high contrast background. That means I can't have a gradient background that has a vast difference in brightness or color across it, right? A lot of people will they'll think, oh, good UI means pretty, so I'll take put a really beautiful gradient background here behind it. And then what's interesting about that is that when people see the gradient from a distance, they'll often be like, oh, cool, right? And then the designer will be like, oh, good feedback, I'm doing the right thing. But then when they go and they try to interact with it, it's much harder to do, right? If you're showing data or controls for an app, you really don't want to have a background that calls attention to itself. You don't. If you want to do a gradient, you want to have a gentle transition, and you want the brightness all the way across to be about the same, right? Because we interpret the color of the item on top of that gradient based on the color around it. So if I have a gradient that runs from red to blue, and I have items at the top of a particular color and the same color down at the bottom, I will perceive those as different colors because of the background. They will not appear to be the same. And if you take the background away, only then will I be able to identify they're the same color. So super important if you've got color-coded information. You want to have to be on a solid background color that is not highly saturated. Because also our brain attributes meaning to saturation. Our brain attributes meaning to high contrast as well, right? That's how we use shadows to delineate objects in space in addition to depth cues, right? But in software, there are no depth cues.
Knowledge workers, and of course, programmers are a type of knowledge workers, are using the computer all day to get work done, and not necessarily need to be exposed to pretty things, but they just want to get things done. And especially office workers who are just pulling up a record, and they're just working with data. Find a record, modify it, do something, hit save, move on to the next one, workflow. I mean, there are just tons of people using a computer to do those kinds of things all day long.
The Azure DevOps podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you. So,
with these types of principles, are there any templates or style sets that you would recommend? That's like the whole package that says, hey, if you're building a CRUD application that's like forms over data, that's just this boring business application, you know what? Just use this template set or style set.
Right. The answer is absolutely no to that. I don't have that. And I think that if you're building that, you're missing an important part of the spec. If that's kind of what you're bringing, if that's your understanding, I feel like you're missing an important part of the spec. And the important part is, okay, what are the things that they're doing all the time?
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to kind of go back and say, okay, if we're going to apply the principles of good design to this, we need to know what is the thing that you are doing all the time. And when we find out those aspects, then we want to come back to those and we want to say, okay, for these important tasks, we want to prioritize. We want to spend some time coming up with good design for these so that our customers, the users, are able to execute those tasks with the least amount of thought and the least amount of physical motion. And so with those, you might create a custom UI that's not the standard data entry template for those. You might give thought in terms of where pieces are. You might give thought to, okay, let's add additional features like filtering, for example, because we want them to quickly find out of this list of noise the pieces they're most interested in. We might even go into saying, well, wait, maybe instead of putting this in a table, what if we showed it had a different way of visualizing it, like a physical map, like a heat map, for example. Right? Or we had a chart, or we had something else, right? Instead of going right to table and right to text box and button and radio button and combo box, avoid combo boxes too. I'll explain one in a second.
Okay.
Instead of going to those, right? Let's completely rethink the UI for something that just allows them to very quickly understand and see the data, right? Because maybe a heat map allows me to very quickly get essentially my executive summary of the data. And then if you want to give me a table, I could drill into the heat map to get to it, right? Maybe we can start also thinking about, and I'm just like off the top of my head here, but what if instead of presenting everything as discrete tables all over the place that are maybe somehow living in parallel to each other, what if we started with a heat map and you could drill in through your Z dimension, right? Your Z axis, right? You drill in as you drill in forward, just by using the mouse wheel and the control key down or something like that, right? If you're using a traditional interface, right? Or zooming in using your fingers, splitting, separating across, right? The pinch and the zoom gestures, right? But if we zoomed in, and as we zoomed in, we changed the view to something that is more appropriate for that finer level of detail, right? So there are ways of rethinking that. I said I'd get back to the combo boxes and why I say avoid those. Combo boxes are not good. They're not good because they're maybe only good in situations where they're going to be infrequently used and there are many, many, many choices and you don't have time. You don't have a lot of development time. And so in that case, I'd say, okay, use a combo box there because you're out of time for development. You can't solve the problem any other way. And you've got a lot of choices and it's infrequently used. But let's say it's used all the time, and let's say there are only a few choices in there. And there are apps that do this like crazy, and they'll make you drop down a combo to pick two choices, for example. That's like the worst case example that I see somewhat frequently. And the problem with it is that first it requires a hit that's a very precise targeted hit on the combo box down piece, right? The little down arrow button. Sometimes they'll go down if you click right inside of the of the text box area. But you need a precise click to drop down. And then the second thing is, notice by the way that when you do that precise click, your eyes are on the thing you want to click on as you're moving the mouse. You're guiding the mouse to the right position, right? So you may know it's like in the upper right, and you just start moving the mouse and you get your eyes up there, right? And then you start looking at it, you fine tune your hand as you're getting in to hit it. You can do that to hit and click the button, not a big deal. But then what happens is when you drop it down, right? Now you can't do anything until it drops down and you see it. So it drops down and now you're like, oh, now I'm visually finding and my mouse is frozen. Right? Essentially, I might be able to move it down towards the middle of it, and if I'm lucky, I don't overshoot it. But really, I'm just frozen until I find it. And then now I can move, and now I've got another precise click required to choose it. Now, if I only got two choices, or even I'd say 5 or 7, or 5 for sure, throw them into radio buttons instead.
Yeah.
The radio button allows me to look at it, target it, click it instantly with one click. It's so much faster than a combo box, right? And it's all about reducing the amount of motion, physical motion, and physical thought. And if you use a combo box, you're challenging the user. And I every time I use a combo box, I'm like, does it meet these criteria, right? Am I out of development time? Are there a lot of choices? In other words, could I solve the problem more effectively with radio buttons?
Right.
Right. What was the other one? Did I out of development time, a lot of choices and infrequently used, right? That's the other one, right? If it's used all the time, we really need to solve the problem another way, figure it out another way. If it's used all the time, use at least a list box with a filter at the top instead of a combo. So at least I've got some items that I can see and I can have a chance of clicking them right there, right? A list box is better if you've got space to do it.
So what is your view on general navigation? Because some of these business applications get really large, over 100 screens, and then they start building navigation. You go to a menu and you go to a certain section, or
right,
just to try to find. I can imagine, precise clicks, and you're going through different ones.
I got a couple views on navigation. I have a couple. One of them is zooming in and out. So let's just say that a lot of navigation, it depends on the data structure, I think too, right? What's the data structure look like in your mind or in the customer's mind as a customer or as a developer? What does the data structure look like? And for me, I live in a world where source code is my data, right? And for me, that kind of looks like a bunch of different files that are, in different places, different classes kind of floating out in space. But some of my classes are related to each other. And my classes are often all related to a namespace and that the namespace contains them. And then once I get out to the namespace, I've got other kinds of dependency relationships. So I've got a kind of relationship there. So I could kind of start, if I imagined my workspace as a sphere, I could say at the center of the sphere, I've got like the method or the class, the code, right? And as I zoom out of that, I've got all of the classes. I can kind of visualize and see all of those. And as I zoom out even further, I can see my project dependencies and relationships. So I could set up that as a mental model. And then I can say, okay, well, instead of just working as code as just a bunch of flat files, what if we added into like Visual Studio or VS Code the ability to scroll your wheel back and zoom out and see a different view, and then do it again, right? So I've got this kind of one of my views on navigation is I guess asking the question: are you really only 2D, or are you maybe 3D? And can you kind of does that make sense to play in that space? Because humans generally play pretty well in a 3D space, at least in terms of mental models, right? I don't think we do well with 4D, but I think we do pretty well with 3D. Related to this idea of zooming, let's just say we're talking about zooming on a flat two-dimensional surface. And let's say I want to zoom into something in the upper left corner of the screen. I feel that every single piece of software out here right now that supports zoom pretty much does it wrong. They force you to zoom and pan in two separate distinct actions. So you zoom in, and what happens? Well, you're zooming probably, a lot of people will say, well, center over the mouse. Okay, is what they'll do. In which case, you're only seeing a portion because the other thing of what you're zooming in is clipped off the upper left of the screen. The other technique I've seen folks use when you zoom in is they will center it, right? But your mouse is now in the upper left corner. So if I center it and now you zoom in again, now I'm going to recenter what's in the upper left, which means you've got this kind of chasing thing that happens. I have to move the mouse to the center of the screen and continue to zoom if I want to. And then the last is, and then, so what happens is people use the first solution where they kind of crop, and then they force you to pan, where you grab the image and drag it to where you want the center position and continue to zoom. I think all of this is wrong. I think the correct way to zoom is that when you zoom in with a mouse and you do this, and you're anywhere not in the center of the screen, the mouse is anywhere not in the center, that it both zooms, takes the center, moves it a little bit towards the center of the screen, but also moves your mouse with you. And some people may be like, what, moving the mouse, that's, heresy. You can't do that, Mark. But the answer is you can, and in certain conditions, when UI at the top changes the underlying piece at the bottom, right? Like if I click something and it moves it, right? Then I want to move the mouse as well. That's what I want to do. So as an example, if you bring up Microsoft Excel and you bring up Find and you have like a document that's got stuff all over it and you click on the Find Next button, it's going to move that dialog to make sure it does not obscure what it's found underneath, if
Right.
what it's found is underneath it. When it moves that dialog, it will also move the mouse, right? So Microsoft Excel is doing it. You can do it, kids. And so that's like another thing when I think about navigation is I think about how everybody is doing zooming wrong. Another aspect of navigation, this is actually based on a feature that we wrote in CodeRush called markers, is often I'm at a place and I want to come back here to this view. So I've got a view into my data, whatever it is. It could be a heat map, it could be a table, it could be any view into data, a chart, it doesn't matter. I'm zoomed in at some point in my data and I want to come back. And CodeRush, same thing. You're looking at your code. In CodeRush, you just hit Alt-Home, it drops a marker. And a marker in CodeRush can mark a point between characters, so like a column position and a line, or you can select something. It can mark a selection either way. And the same applies to regular data, customer data. You could mark that I was in this particular field editing it, right? Or maybe this field was selected, or the whole row was selected, right? Or maybe several rows were selected. But in addition to that, one of the things that we do is we also mark data about the view. So for example, if I'm looking at code down at the bottom of the screen and I drop a marker and I go 100 other places and I come back and I start collecting those markers, when I return, CodeRush is going to shift that view so the code is right at the bottom of the screen again. And what that does is that gives you about a 500 to 600 millisecond boost in recognition. You're able to recognize the code that much faster than you could otherwise if we suddenly put it in the middle of the screen, like a lot of folks do when you do navigation. Right. So again, think about this, right? So the shortcut, if you're a developer and you're doing navigation, is to stick things in the middle of the screen, right? Or allow them to be cropped when really they want to zoom in on that city in the upper left of your map, right? So think about what the user wants, get them what they want in the view, and start thinking about things like where are they looking, what is the view, and realize that we can recognize code way better, or whatever it is, data, much more easily if it's in the exact same position that we saw it in before, right? We absolutely can. And if we can recognize it faster, that means our cognitive load is lower. And that's what we're trying to do, right?
Awesome.
Lower that cognitive load.
You mentioned CodeRush, and this is your day job or one of your day jobs. And so for those maybe who haven't used CodeRush before, or maybe it was many, many years ago, Visual Studio 2019 is coming out with all kinds of new things. So what's the encouragement for the listener to go and try CodeRush, and what should they expect when they grab it?
Okay. Well, so that's I think a great question. CodeRush is about making developers faster so that you can write more code with less thought and with less physical effort. That's like the essence of behind everything in there. So if we can find ways to like show you information that you want, like one of our features is the debug visualizer. And the debug visualizer, as you step into a method or you step through code, will show you, like for example, the values of the parameters of that method call. And they'll show them to you right underneath the parameter declaration in the code. So we don't have to move our eyes to a watch window. We don't have to reach for the mouse to grab the watch window to bring it up. They're just there. And they're always there when you go and step into a method. They're just right there. As you step through the code, it shows you the values that changed on each line right above, for example. And again, it's just right where you want to look at it. And as you're about to execute, let's say I'm on a switch statement, or maybe I'm on an if-else block with nested if-elses. If I'm there at that, and CodeRush can evaluate that code without side effects, CodeRush will evaluate that code and tell you which of the blocks you're going to jump into. So if it's a simple test like, Boolean test or something like that, referencing fields and no properties, right? CodeRush can evaluate that. So it'll tell you which one of those switch statements you're about to go into. And the way it tells you is by de-emphasizing the other paths. So we call that dead code path de-emphasis. A lot of words, but basically what's happening is the code you're going to go into appears syntax highlighted as normal and everything else looks dimmer. right? So you can tell before you execute the line of code, which is incredibly valuable if you're on an if statement or a switch statement, and you're about to jump to an unexpected location, and you think you're about to jump to right where you're looking at, but now you can immediately tell that before you execute the line of code and then incur the cost of jumping to the surprise location and then now having to scroll back up or move or do whatever you want to do and maybe even go back and reset variables because things have been changed, right? To then figure it out. Right. So it kind of gives you a look back in time, a look forward in time, and also allows you to drill into expressions. So I can drill into expressions. If I have an expression that's false and I'm not sure why, I can just drill into that. And the drilling in, the UI all happens on the surface of the code editor as well. So if I need more space, it increases the line height until I don't need it anymore and then drops it back down. But what I can do is I can take a complex expression, drill into it, and see, well, this is false. That means these two expressions were since they're ORed together, they were both false. And then go down. And what it also does is it'll highlight if the expression. So like say, for example, my topmost expression was true, and it consists of two sub-expressions that were ORed together, and only one of those was true. The one that was true is going to be highlighted because it's the one that determined its parent's expression's value, because the other one was false. And so what you can do is if you want to know why something is a particular value, which is the whole purpose of drilling in, I would assume, right? We highlight the path that determines the value above, right? What that is. So if these expressions were added and one of them was false, we would highlight the false expression. So that's like a drill down into one feature of CodeRush.
Sounds like turning the code into a video game.
Well, it's not that interactive. It's not that fun. It's not.
No explosions in the background. And maybe the exception nuclear bomb.
No, if you want that, you can watch my show on Twitch, twitch.tv/CodeRushed. That's CodeRush with the letters ED at the end. We actually do explosions, including we've done a couple of shows with live explosions set off from the chat room. So we'll do virtual ones on the code because we're programming in Visual Studio 2019, and we're doing that live. And we're actually dog fooding the product live 3 times a week, which is
3 times a week.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah, and we were talking about code quality before we when we were at Build together. And one of the things that was kind of surprising to me is that I really think that the live dog fooding has led to an increase in quality of the product in a way that other traditional techniques don't get. As an example, a couple things. When we see a problem on the show, it's recorded. And all the steps that led to it are right there, right? The source code we're using is, all open source and checked in. So it's, it's easy access to the source. We check in before we start every show. So it's easy to reproduce. Also, sometimes I might see a small thing and I want to change it, right? And normally now I work remotely for my team of devs, right? So I'm not in the same room as them, which means if I have a small, if I want any kind of change, the change has got to be big enough to warrant me sitting down, composing a spec, right? And sending, which means we get, I do that for big features and for medium-sized issues, but for tiny, tiny issues, I don't do that. But on the show, I do it for tiny issues. Right? If I see a small little thing, and I've got a co-host on there from the UK, Rory Becker. He's awesome. And Rory is like, and I'm like, Rory, note the time. When I say those words, he knows what to do. Right? And then I start creating the spec or saying the small change I want, whatever it is. And then that turns into an email with a link to the time and essentially a video demo of me. And it's effortless to create these now. And I love that. And so, the show has been as beneficial or more beneficial for me than I think for the people who are watching it, who I think have fun as well watching the stuff we do, which is a little crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Awesome. So before we go, this has been a lot of really interesting information, but before we go, what should our listeners follow up on? You mentioned your Twitch channel. That's definitely one.
Yeah, I think that if you're at all interested in good design, definitely take a look at sgui.com. Science of Great UI, the initials for that, sgui.com. Sign up for the email course there. Take a look at what's there, and take a look at the preview for the course that's out at DevIQ. That is the result of 12 years of deeply focused research on the science of great design, and it contains a lot of, I guess I would say, arguably totally original content. So it's like 9 hours of totally original content you're not going to see anywhere else, unless they've seen my talk and they're kind of also presenting it, I suppose. So I recommend that. Go if you were interested in taking a look at CodeRush. It's at devexpress.com/CodeRush, and I would definitely recommend that as well if you're a developer working in Visual Studio. It has strong support for C#, Visual Basic, and I'd say a medium level of support for TypeScript and JavaScript. And that's most of we're working on that and making that better, but it's not as refined as the C# and VB stuff. But what's I think is maybe interesting to you is even if you grab that, and you can also get that off of the Visual Studio Marketplace. I think looking at that, even if you end up not using it, but looking at it from the standpoint of, okay, so, how good is the design here, right? What's going on here with these, with what Mark's doing here and what the team is doing with regards to, implementing this, and kind of evaluate it from a critical standpoint. I think, not everything we do in there is perfect. I'll certainly say that, right? Just like everybody, we're balancing resources and time and features and things that we want to do, right? But I think that you're gonna find that it's above average, not bad, and in some cases really, really good. Like, take a look, for sure you'll want to take a look at our reorder parameters UI. That is going to probably blow your mind. And I'll probably just say that. Should I just do that as my tease? Reorder parameters. Awesome. It's actually like a video game. You're actually going to see your parameters animated and moved through. And it's actually, everything that's done there makes sense. It's not crazy. It's actually the most efficient way to reorder parameters in a function. Nice. And to do it right there in code.
Thanks so much, Mark, for visiting with me. This is a great talk.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I love hanging out with you, and I love your questions are awesome. And you should get some sort of award. Can I present that to you right now?
Yeah, please make that happen.
I'm looking for something on my desk that I can, facilitate a trophy out of. I think I've got a case for my earphones and some dice, and I'm going to put that on there and lift that up to the camera for you right there, buddy.
Nice,
there
amazing.
There's your.
I feel so honored.
Your good roll dice.
I'd like to thank the whole team. I'd like to thank the Academy.
Good.
And
Please do. It had nothing to do with it. It was just me. All right, buddy. Well, thank you.
And until next week, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.